So I'm going to start with a really simple model, a 3-act model of structure, one that you've probably heard of before. And that's the idea that stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, I remember being told that at school and wondering what on earth that meant, and it really didn't make sense to me. So I'm just going to give you a bit more detail about what that actually means. So the beginning of a story, this is the exposition. It's where we describe the current situation, the status quo for our characters and our protagonist, or i.e. our main character. Now then something happens. This is called the inciting incident. The inciting incident is the thing that happens that changes everything so that the story can begin. Without the inciting incident, we don't really have a story at all. Then we have the middle bit of the story. This is where we get what we call complications and rising action. So things get more difficult for the protagonist. They get easier, more difficult, easier. And the story keeps going and going until we reach a climax. And then we have our ending, which is the resolution. And that leads us to a new status quo. So to put a bit of context on this, let's imagine we're talking about a love story, because that's one of the easiest to fit into this model. So the beginning, the exposition of a love story, what we have there is two people who are single, who've never met before, who don't know each other. And the inciting incident in a love story is when those two people meet for the first time. And it might be that that leads to love at first sight, or it might be a bit more of a Pride and Prejudice sort of story where they hate each other to begin with. But it leads to complications. It leads to more things happening between them. It leads to what we call rising action as the stakes get higher and higher through the story as they start to like each other more and more. And the resolution of a traditional love story, at least, is that the two of them get together. So the new status quo is their new relationship. So I'm going to go with an example that hopefully most people are familiar with, and that is Cinderella. So at the beginning of Cinderella, we have this horrible situation for poor Cinders. Her mother's died, her father's remarried, her stepmother hates her stepsisters hate her, and she's pretty much treated like a servant and made to clean up after everybody. It's horrendous. But then this exciting thing happens. The prince sends an invitation to everybody, inviting them to a ball. He's looking for a bride. He's obviously a bit of an open-minded prince because he sends it to everyone, but there we go. We won't argue with that or any of the plot holes in the story. It's a fairy story. It's magic. We'll go with that. So then we have a bunch of complications. So first of all, Cinderella isn't allowed to go. Her stepmother won't let her. She's got nothing to wear. But then along comes the fairy godmother and makes everything happen. But the magic only lasts till midnight. Do you get the picture? We've got these complications. It's a little bit like a game of unfortunately, fortunately. Unfortunately, the magic runs out at midnight. Fortunately, Cinderella drops a glass slipper and the prince comes looking for her, and so on and so on. And then we have our resolution, our ending in this case, and this is where the slipper fits Cinderella. Again, by magic, it doesn't fit anyone else in the kingdom, only Cinderella. And the prince has found his love, and they live happily ever after, which is often our ending in a fairy story, and actually in certain types of Hollywood movie as well. So this is Freytag's pyramid, which is another way of looking at 3-act structure, and diagrams can be useful, so I thought I'd bring this in. So with Freytag's pyramid, we have the exposition, which is pretty much the same as before in our basic model, our initial status quo, followed by an inciting incident, which leads to that rising action, the unfortunately part of the story, which leads to a climax, and then falling action, and finally to a denouement, which is the same thing as the resolution of the story, just a posh French way of saying it. So let's apply this to Cinderella to help us understand it. So with Cinderella, our exposition, and that is poor Cinders having a hard, hard life. And then, of course, we get the invitation to the ball, leading to the rising action. We have the fairy godmother, the ball, the prince falls in love with her, the magic runs out at midnight, all of those wonderful things. The climax here in this particular story is when the glass slipper fits Cinderella and the prince finally knows he's found his true love. And then we have a bit of falling action. And this is where Cinderella and the prince, they get married, but terrible things happen to the ugly sisters. And in certain versions of the fairy tale, they're really bad, but we won't go there. And then the denouement of this story, and that is where they all live happily ever after. Isn't that nice? Except for the sisters, of course. Bless them. Okay, to summarise that, I think that we can pull both of those models together and come up with some principles really that we can take away with us. So the first thing I'd say is that it's really clear to me that at the beginning of a story, we need to set everything up and make sure that the reader knows what's going on. And that then we need some conflict of some kind and a sense of things getting more complicated, that fortunately, unfortunately part of the story. And that needs to lead up to a climax and then a resolution that's going to be satisfying for the reader. Now, in the story we looked at, that was happily ever after, but that probably wouldn't be typical of more contemporary stories and certainly of literary stories. But we do need something there. We do need a resolution, a denouement, which is going to satisfy our reader.